Hello, and welcome to All the Grief, a regular podcast for all those who have been touched by grief. We are your hosts. I am Rebecca Luttrell.
And I am Andrea Mathern. We are two friends, a therapist, and a social scientist, both highly sensitive fellow grievers, here to share our hearts as we talk about all the grief.
Good morning, Andrea.
Good morning, Rebecca.
How is your heart this morning?
It was frazzled. My internet went out last night. And when this has happened before, if I can't get it with the unplugging deal, it comes online in a couple of hours. And so I was sure that when I woke up this morning, it would be on, and it wasn't. And so this morning I sort of spent like an hour and a half on the phone, and we didn't get it resolved, but I'm here. Seeing you and our guest has actually really settled my heart. So I'm feeling much better. I'm so glad to be right here. My heart's feeling really settled and ready to kind of have this beautiful conversation. How is your heart this morning?
My heart is bubbly. I feel really joyful about our guest today. There was a time when I practically saw her daily, and I'm so nomadic typically that I always have this there's people I love that I don't live near. And that just feels true for so much of my life right now. So when I get to spend sweet, sacred time having deep conversations with people I love, I just feel bubbly. So I feel happy this morning.
That sounds so beautiful. I'm so glad that you shared that. I'm so excited for you, which makes me excited for our guest.
Yeah, so let me introduce our guest. This is my good friend, Lindsay Bomstein. Lindsay lives in Tampa, Florida, where I used to live, and knew her husband, 2 of her 3 children, but now she has 3 children. She had one sweet baby when I had moved away. She was born in New Jersey, grew up in Arizona, and spent her 20s in Santa Barbara. She's written this amazing blog called Sit and Smile, and we'll include the link in the show notes. She's been writing it since 2013.
Wow.
Holy moly, over 10 years. Crazy. About topics such as parenting, mindfulness, mental health, creativity, and grief. She has a Master of Arts in Transpersonal Psychology from Sophia University, and she currently leads women's circles, and she co-hosts yoga and art retreats. Welcome, Lindsay.
Thank you. I'm so happy to be here. What an honor.
And how is your heart this morning?
Such a good question. My heart feels really warm and touched and tender, soft, malleable. My heart feels good. My mind and the rest of my body feels a little frazzled. I think there's some interesting energy surrounding this upcoming election. So I am just trying to stay grounded and really in touch with my heart. I started this morning just sitting on my couch and taking a few deep breaths and putting my hands on my heart and just trying to come from that heart space. Because if I come into this, I'm a little bit like, whoa, what's happening out there in the world? I'm so happy to be here with you two today. Thank you for having me.
Yes, thank you for being here. And you're here. I mean, there's a million reasons I would have asked you to be here. And you wrote a book and you've put it out in the world. So we have lots of questions about this beautiful book that we've read.
Yes. So the title is All I Feel Is Love, A Journey Through Loss, Healing, and the Messy Magic of Being Human. I love that part so much.
Thank you.
We often ask our guests to start with what we have started calling our grief origin story, or that first significant loss where our world sort of gets flipped upside down. And your book certainly starts with what I perceive to be your grief origin story, but we'd love to hear you tell us about that first monumental loss.
Absolutely. I'm going to give you a little background story kind of leading up to the death that rocked my world originally. So my family is originally from New Jersey, and I'm the youngest of 4. My siblings are quite a bit older than me. The closest in age is my sister Carrie, and she's 6 years older. And then I have a brother and my oldest sister, who's 11 years older than me. So my family had moved from New Jersey to Arizona when I was 7. And I kind of grew up in Arizona. And then we moved back to New Jersey when I was a junior in high school. So my siblings were all out of the house at this point. And it was me, my mom, and my dad. And we moved that summer before my junior year of high school. And, it was a different part of New Jersey, not the part that we were from, but we moved to kind of the central coast, a little bit north of what people think of as the Jersey Shore. And, I was still kind of like, I was getting my bearings. And it was a difficult move. I think moving when you're in the middle of high school can be tricky anywhere you are, but Arizona to New Jersey was just very different. So it was a bit shocking, even though I was familiar with it. So the date was actually December 1st. So it was a week after Thanksgiving. When I think about this, it's all of these details that come flooding back. So I can feel them in my body. I can feel like what the air smelled like and what it looked like, what the lighting was like. And I had gone to school that day, and my dad and I that morning had gotten in a silly argument about me doing a voice recital that I didn't want to do. It was a very typical morning, but we were kind of bickering, not a huge deal. He left to drive to a meeting, and I went to school. And that day was it was really strange. There was just this sense of foreboding that I felt the entire day. Like I felt really off. I did not feel like myself, but I couldn't pinpoint it. I didn't know what was going on. I was a teenager, so my dad and I were arguing a lot. My parents and I argued. That was nothing too out of the ordinary. So I came home after hanging out with some friends. We had gone to do some errands after school. I got home kind of in the late afternoon, early evening. And it was like the minute I walked in my front door, I could tell something was wrong. There were no lights on. My mom wasn't home. She was usually home at that time during the day. So it was just like my heart started beating a little bit faster. I was kind of walking around like, what's going on? And there was a note on the kitchen counter saying that my father had been in a car accident and my mom would get in touch with me when she could. So, those were the times before cell phones, and there was no way I could reach my mom. I can't remember how much time elapsed, but, I spent the next hour or so just kind of walking around my house trying to busy myself, calling friends, watching TV, and I just couldn't settle. And finally the phone rang, and it was my brother who had gone to meet my mom when she had called him at work. And he got on the phone and his voice just kind of cracked. And he was like, Lindsay, it's not good. And that was about all I knew at that point. He was like, we'll call you back. We'll let you know more when we know. He told me that a truck when my dad was on his way to this meeting, it was about a 2-hour drive from where we live. So he was in White Plains, New York, and a truck had hit him head on. And so, that was kind of all I knew. So I hung up the phone and was like, okay, what do I do now? And ended up talking to my oldest sister, and she, knowing that I couldn't drive myself to this hospital that they were at, she offered to have a car service come and pick me up. About an hour later, I got in the car with a good friend of mine who I talk a lot about in the book, my friend Erica, and we got to the hospital a couple hours later. It's nighttime at this point, and I walk into the ICU to see my dad, and he's just incoherent. He never regained consciousness after the accident. So he was all bandaged up. It was all head trauma. So it was very, very scary.
Of course.
That sense of being in this hospital room with, the bright lights and all of the sounds. And it was just so jarring. And the doctors weren't really telling us much at that point. It was kind of like he's suffered this severe head trauma, but we don't know how significant that is. And we won't know much until the swelling goes down. So it was kind of like a wait and see kind of thing. So the next 2 days we remained up in that area of New York, and, family was trickling in. My siblings came in, my dad's brothers. And like I said, he never regained consciousness, although we had moments where I felt like he was present and able to hear what was going on somehow.
Mm-hmm.
So the accident was on a Wednesday. And then that Friday morning, my brother and I got in the car to drive back down to New Jersey and get, my mom's medicine and stuff that she would need over the next number of days. Because we just didn't know. We still had no idea like what we were looking at
Yeah.
and how long this was going to be. And so we were at the house in New Jersey when my sister called and said, stay put, don't rush back. He's taken a turn for the worse. We'll let you know what happens. And so again, it was that like moment of being sort of paralyzed and just being like, oh my God, what's going on? And she had called back about a half an hour later and told us that he had died.
Mm-hmm.
And it was just such a shock to the system.
Yeah.
And that moment of just hearing that and being like, oh my God, what now? What now?
Yeah. Thank you for sharing your story, Lindsay. I mean,
Yeah.
I remember, we met in a women's group and I knew it was like, you just know when you meet a kindred spirit. So I sort of knew immediately. You were dressed cool and I liked that, but this is someone that speaks my language, understands things. And it was a period of time before we sort of learned that we both had lost our dads, but I never fully heard the story. And when I was reading the book and, now as you share here, it's like knowing a thing and feeling your heart break just to know a thing and hearing like the fullness of the story. And I know it's been years. I know you do so much work integrating your own grief, but it's still just like a heartbreaking story. This sweet 17-year-old sort of in between worlds because of moving and feeling this forebodingness in the day. Like I think as highly sensitive people, we all have had those times where like something's just off. And and I feel curious as you're sharing this story, this piece around being 17. We just interviewed Rebecca Feinglass and she was talking about her mom had cancer for most of her life. And when she died, it was the summer before she was in 9th grade or 10th grade. And she's like, I just wanted so badly not to be the girl whose mom had died. And I was trying to be normal and just fit in. And I'm curious if that resonates.
100%. And, I already felt being the new girl at this small, homogenous public high school in New Jersey. I already felt sort of like the kooky one, and then that happened. And it was like going to school. I was trying to remember recently, like how much time did I take off? And I honestly think it was only like a week that I took off from school. Like it was not a lot of time, because there was this sense of my mom was very much like, okay, we have to keep going pretty much from the get-go. It was like, everyone's got to return to work, you've got to go back to school. And I understand that impulse because it's bringing normalcy, but it was just so awful and strange to be like, I didn't know anyone at that time. I didn't know anyone else who had lost a parent, and I didn't know anyone else who had really gone through that kind of sudden death. I felt so alone and strange and isolated. And God bless all of these high school students kind of looking around, and everyone is like, you can tell they're compassionate. But it's like no one knows what to say. So the majority of people didn't say anything. So then it's just this sense of, oh my God, okay, I feel like talk about living in between two worlds. I'm like, okay, my whole world was just turned upside down. And now I'm kind of at school pretending that everything is back to normal. Okay, go to math class with Mr. Esposito, who was never very nice to me in the first place. And it was just such a strange, very, very lonely time. And I think what you guys are doing on this podcast is so important and speaks so directly to my heart, because the sense of normalizing grief and talking about it and bringing it out into the open, I felt like I couldn't tell my grief origin story for a long time because it didn't feel like people wanted to hear it.
Yeah.
And it was like, what do I do? Just at a party start talking about, it was like hard to even find the time and the place So thank you for doing what you do on this podcast, because it's so important as anyone, as a person, just to have the space to tell these stories. But yeah, certainly as a teenager, there was a lot going on.
The stakes are high. And just
Yeah.
like you're saying, this sense of returning to normalcy, that your mom having this wish for you to say, oh, let's just kind of try to be as normal as possible. And like
Hmm.
being in an environment where other 17-year-olds don't know what to say or do keeps it from being
Right.
normal at all. Like, I think even if this had been the school you had been in your whole life and grown up
Yeah,
with these people, they still would have been
that's right.
awkward. And I don't have the answer yet for helping children also be able to sit with the grief of their peers. I mean, we start with us.
Right.
When we don't, as adults, know how to talk about grief or be normal in grief, our kids are just like, we don't talk about it. I hope that doesn't happen to me. It almost becomes contagious or.
Yeah, that's right. And one of the experiences that I've had later on in life is working with our local hospice here.
Mm-hmm.
And their bereavement center is amazing. And they have this children's grief center. What they do for kids is just so empowering. And it's removing that piece of being isolated and different. So it's like, yeah, they don't have all the answers and it still sucks and it's still hard what these kids are going through. But they have all of these opportunities for children, for teenagers who have lost a loved one, to be together in community
Mm-hmm.
and share their stories. And it starts with the little ones coming together to play and to sometimes act out their experiences. This was such a cool experience. I had one day volunteering there where I was with a little boy and he was dressing up like a firefighter because he had lost a parent in an accident. So he's dressing up like a firefighter and he's telling me about the story that way. And it was just like a few moments and then we were on to something else. But it was like within those few moments, he got it out. I listened and something healing happened in that telling and that receiving. It was really beautiful. So I look at what they're doing with their children's camps and their family camps, and I think, wow, that would have been, again, I was a teenager, so I may have dug in my heels if someone suggested it. But I look at what they are trying to do, and there is something, just as we know with being in women's groups and circles and grief groups,
Yes.
sharing your story and having someone say, oh my God, me too.
Absolutely.
And I felt that way also. And it was so hard. And so that was just a piece, that I didn't have at all until much later. And I think it's so healing.
You're so right. It's like as adults, and why we have this podcast is because we don't know how to sit with each other's grief as adults. And even as adults, you feel so alone in this thing that is a shared human experience, which is just so bizarre.
Yeah.
But I agree with Rebecca. There's something so pivotal about that happening at that moment in time. Just 17, but it wasn't just 17. It was 17 and a move from two cultures in our country that are very different. And so what was those next few years like for you? You write a little bit about it in the book, and a lot happens in those coming years.
A lot happened. Those years for me, the rest of my junior year and my senior year of high school were like, I look back and I'm like, I have a lot of positive, happy memories. So there were a lot of good things that happened. And typical teen things, going to prom and breaking up with one guy and having a new boyfriend. But as far as the grief goes, when I think about that, it was kind of non-existent. It was there. Certainly it was there. It was bubbling up underneath the surface. But the way that I handled it was by pushing it down. I had a few people that I would talk to my brother a lot about my grief and our experience losing our dad, and especially because we were together through so much of it. And I think we're learning so much. We know so much more about bringing things out in the open now. And at that time, it was early 90s, so kind of coming out of the 80s. And there was a lot of that, just like sweep it under the rug. If things are messy or ugly, we don't talk about it. It's like, oh, who wants to, listen to you complain? And you don't want to talk about that. So you sweep it under the rug and you keep going. And that's kind of how I felt. And my mom had had a lot of loss in her life. And I think about her having to all of a sudden parent a teenager by herself. And I'm like, oh my God, it was a lot.
Yeah.
And my mom was also someone who she was very optimistic and she just kept going. She always kept going. While that is an incredible coping mechanism, there was also a piece of like, oh my God, we just need to stop going for a while and feel. And I'm a big crier. So I'm like, or I've already had tears in my eyes a couple times and I love crying and we could talk about that. But I didn't certainly as a kid because I've always been super sensitive and very highly empathic. And my mom was sensitive as well. And when she would talk about sensitivity, it was kind of a negative thing. It was like, oh God, I'm super sensitive. And, I take this personally. And if she felt tears come on, she'd kind of wave them away like they were a nuisance. So I sort of like, I would witness that and be like, oh yeah, in my head, the messaging I got and from the culture at large was that, showing emotion is bad and being tearful is a sign of weakness. So you keep going. And now I'm like, oh my God, bring on the tears. Like, just let me cry. I feel so much better afterwards. It's a sign of connection and feeling and depth. Yeah, Andrea, to go back to your question, those years were just kind of like a getting through, making the best of the situation. I still do this. Like, there's a lot of that, could have been worse. What if my mom had been in the car with my dad? What if I had been in the car with my dad? What if I lost a sibling in addition to that? So it was like this dismissing the grief and the sadness I did feel because I should be grateful. I have so much, so much support and we live in a beautiful home. And so, yes, this is terrible, but people go through much worse. And, again, that is such, I think, an interesting thing we do as humans, downplaying it, or there's a hierarchy of grief there, So I did a lot of that. It wasn't until I got to college, even my choice to go to the school that I went to was super random. It was just kind of like, oh, that's fine. I got in. It's close to New Jersey. I can drive back and forth. I didn't want to be too far away from my mom. My boyfriend from high school at the time was going to the same school. So I made that choice, I think, out of a place of grief. It wasn't intentional. I didn't know that at the time. But looking back, I'm like, oh, yeah. I mean, I wasn't in my right state of mind. And so that was when I started feeling, those first 2 years of college, a lot of anxiety for me started bubbling up.
Yeah.
That's when I was like, okay, I've got to take a look at what this is. And it really felt like it was all coming from this unprocessed grief of losing my dad and losing him suddenly. The trauma of that.
Yeah.
I never really understood how these physiological responses that my body was happening, like I would fall asleep in class and my teacher would touch me on the shoulder and I would jump. And that was this response of just being so scared of what's going to happen next. When is the other shoe going to drop?
Yeah.
That anxiety really was a way for me to be like, okay, it's time to start looking at this.
Yeah. The body keeps the score.
Absolutely.
And our bodies start to tell us something's not okay.
Yeah.
I say it so often because it feels inevitable that someone had, an early grief or as a child experienced maybe watching someone else's grief and the sense of, oh, the kids seem to be doing fine. They're coping, but have they really been able to tell their story? Maybe it's more than, did they cry? Were they angry? Did they break things? Did they move their grief? I mean, first is, do they feel comfortable telling their story? Have they had the opportunity to tell their story? Because telling our stories is how we keep processing. I think of Daniel Siegel's work where he talks about a little boy, he was in a car accident with the babysitter. He keeps telling the story. He's very young and it's just like, ambulance. She went to hospital and he keeps telling it and they're kind of like, why does he keep telling it? But he's like, that's how he's processing it. And to just let us tell our stories, starting theirs.
Absolutely. And I've realized there is this healing in the repetitive nature of telling the story. And this is kind of where the writing for me comes in, and writing has been such a healing outlet and gift. Getting into the story and remembering those details. What did the air feel like? What did it smell like? What did it look like? Who was there? And there's something in, and maybe you can speak to this, Rebecca, but there's something within that retelling that helps sort of, it's not that you're going to be able to make sense of your grief and losses, but there's something in that retelling that helped me wrap my head around it and move from the shock of it to the allowing of it and the inevitable acceptance of this is what happened and it sucks. And it's going to always suck. You're never going to forget or move on, but you can move with it and make some meaning from the experience.
Yeah, you just exactly said it. I mean, you put it in the intro of your book where you say, we all have stories to tell, and the telling is in and of itself healing. And I think that that's true for exactly the reasons you're saying. There was someone who was talking about, I think it was also Rebecca Feinglass, talking about learning that acceptance wasn't that this is okay that this happened. Acceptance was this sucks that this happened and it happened. And so it's just relating to reality. You later do a nice job of describing in your book kind of the way that you're working with all of the memory. Our memory isn't just, these were the facts of what happened. Our body holds the memory. It's the way that people in grief anniversaries that they don't quite remember, suddenly their bodies start feeling weird. Oh, the light is changing in season. And this is when my dad died. And now I know why I've been on edge for 2 weeks and, knowing all of that. But the more we can bring in of remembering to let our bodies settle, it does help, like you said, to be able to move with grief. You're never going to get over it or get through it. You're just moving with it.
Yeah, absolutely. And that kind of what I mentioned before, like that dismissive nature, that impulse to be like, oh, well, it could have been worse. It could have been worse. There's something that is also been so healing to me, like the admittance of, oh my God, no, this is tough.
And it was terrible.
And it was terrible. And it sucked. And I'm going to be okay. But that didn't come until much later for me. It wasn't an immediate thing. It really wasn't until I started going to therapy and getting some more perspective about what was going on when that happened and how I coped and, like just ignoring it, ignoring my feelings. That was never going to be the answer. I needed the time to go within, to be quiet, to process, to feel my feelings, to feel all of that sadness and the longing and the missing. All of these years later, I'm terrible at math, but I'm almost 50. All of these years later, just the sense that I still miss my dad a lot. I could cry saying that right now. Oh my God, I'll see like a young woman like with her dad or a grandfather. And I'm like, oh, my kids never had that. They didn't have that with my dad. My husband and I are coming up on our 20th wedding anniversary, and he never met my dad. He didn't know my dad. And so honoring that sadness is still there, that longing, that missing him. And that is also really sweet to me because it almost feels celebratory, celebrating how much I loved him.
Love him. Present tense.
And love him. Absolutely. That's right. Love him now and how he still shows up in magical ways.
So the book also encompasses so many different kinds of losses. So your dad being that grief origin and something that you've continued, obviously, to integrate and understand throughout your life. And I think Rebecca and I were both tears in our eyes when you were talking about your dad not knowing your partner, your dad not knowing your kids. I know that is exactly Rebecca's experience. My dad died when my boys were just 2. And so they knew him, but didn't get the grandfather that he got to be for his other grandkids, which, is just, it makes so many moments really, really bittersweet. But there are some other losses, and there was one that struck me, and I wonder if you sort of categorize it as grief or as a loss, but my heart broke when you left California. So you end up in California. You do such a beautiful job of illustrating this life in Santa Barbara, which just is like sort of aesthetically this beautiful space, right? If you've been there, but you do such a beautiful job of sort of bringing us into that world when you and Josh first met and are in this place, and eventually you leave. And I felt heartbreak.
Oh, Andrea, I love your
As you
soul.
left.
I love your sweetheart for saying that and noticing that.
Yeah,
Yeah, thank you.
I really felt that one.
I love that you are asking about that because it is a loss, moving is a big deal. And I tell that when I'm doing like work with my younger self, I always am like, remember, Lindsay, that, moving is one of the top stressors in life. It's a big deal. There's a reason why it's a lot. And California to me was just the fact that we ended up there felt kind of magical because I had been there when I was a young girl and I just was like, this place is so gorgeous and there's a lightness, there was a levity. It was just, I fell in love with it. And after my husband and I met and he graduated from college, it was like, let's move to California. And there was not a lot of practical guidance or decision making in that. It was just kind of like, oh, I'll find a school. I want to move to California and I'll find a school there that fits the bill. And so people thought I was a little crazy. I don't think everyone was really on board with that decision, but my husband and I were, and we went, and it wasn't that it wasn't tricky at times. Of course it was, and meeting people and adjusting, but there's something about that land too. And I think that this is really interesting to think about the geographic locations, the land that feels like it's nurturing us. And nature is so powerful, so healing in relation to grief, I think. And Santa Barbara, there are these beautiful gumdrop mountains on the other side of the highway. So it's like the ocean and the mountains. And the fact that you have both is just otherworldly. And I felt like the mountains there were hugging me. They almost look like they're like softness. It's like, oh, a woman's bosom, it's like this softness you want to like lay your head on. But it felt like they were embracing me. And Santa Barbara, the saint, it felt that way in my soul. So we were there for a long time. We tried to move actually to Colorado at one point in the middle there. And we were like, no, let's go back. Not that we don't love Colorado, because we do, but we ended up going back to Santa Barbara. And yet it was hard to leave. And it was interesting to leave something not because I was done with it. And this was also like a really great lesson for me. It was like, oh no, we're leaving because we want to embrace something else. We're not running away from, but we're running towards this new experience of wanting to start a family and my husband wanting to work with his father. So it was hard to go. It was exciting to go. But yeah, that adjusting to being in Tampa, like that time period. And that was right around when I met Rebecca. And I was like, oh my God, I love you. Yes, we're speaking the same language. Because I just felt like such a fish out of water here for a long time. I used to say that I would pine for Santa Barbara like I was pining for like a lost love. The first couple of years, I was like, how can we get back?
Yeah.
What can we do to get back?
What I think is interesting even about where you landed, you're right. Like there's something so healing in nature. And there's a lot about the ocean that has been written with the analogy of like, it's salt water like our tears.
Yes.
Martine Prechtel writes about it.
Yeah.
Even in my sort of back-to-back series of tragedies that happened in the course of 2 years, my brother and sister and I drove to the ocean because we were like, we have to go to the ocean and just like make an offering of our sorrow because the ocean can hold it.
Yeah.
Colorado probably didn't speak to you at the time because you're like, it's so landlocked, which I do feel living here. But then I'm learning from people who are native Coloradans to really embrace the mountains. And there's so much nature and it's beautiful.
Yeah.
And I miss the ocean. ocean.
I know. They're both beautiful. And like they might speak to you at different times, and
Totally.
walking on the beach, I've always felt really connected to my father and my mom when I'm walking on the beach
Mhm.
and just to life in general and the ebbing and the flowing. And there's something about the Gulf here. They're not big waves, but this beautiful little ripple
Mm,
and the water just like coming and going, receding and then coming back and recede. And like that dance,
mhm,
walking alongside that, it's like, okay, no matter what is going on in my life right now, this coming and going, it's okay. We're in the flow. There is more to this than we can possibly wrap our head around or understand in our human form, and just enjoying that dance of the coming and going and the ripple of the water. It's so healing to me. But it's interesting because when my mom died, she died 7 years ago, the land that was speaking to me was Arizona. I wanted to go back
hmm,
to Arizona, and I did a retreat in Sedona a number of months after she died. And it was like there was something about being in those surroundings with that red rock
yeah,
that felt very Mother Earth, like felt very maternal. Like I just wanted to kiss the ground.
mhm,
So it was interesting. Like it was a totally different experience, but I felt very nurtured by that
mhm,
land
yeah,
at that time.
Yeah, I love that different land speaks to you at different times. I'm from Colorado, so I never was an ocean person. Like I was fascinated and I loved when we went, but I was also like, just swim in a pool and you don't get any sand on you. And like
Because there's no seaweed,
right.
you
Or
know?
there's no
sharks.
seaweed's
Yeah.
gonna brush your leg.
Yeah.
Like just but having kids, I was like, Bryce, I have to go to the ocean every year. Like I just feel this call. And for me, our mountains are so,
Mm,
they're ancient and they hold everything. And so I love that you're drawn to different things. I just spent a week in the desert in Arizona.
mm,
And just different lands. The sky is different. The vibration of the land, the animals that you are surrounded by are
yep.
different. And so I love that you were so tuned in to know, like, my place with my dad feels like the ocean, and my place with my mom really felt like the desert.
Yeah. There's just something about getting in touch when you're in grief, getting in touch with nature and just remembering that connection,
Yeah.
that we're all connected is just so looking at the stars and thinking about how long they've been there.
Yeah.
And just when you said the mountains hold it, they hold everything. That is just a very grounding and passive kind. We talk about doing the grief work, and it's like, yes, there's a lot of work to be done, but there's also a lot of relaxing
Mm,
to be done, and that feels so good to me too, to be like, oh my God, let the earth
mm,
support you. Let the ground underneath your feet give you energy. Let the mountains hug you. Let the water
Mhm.
soothe you.
mm.
Let that happen too. You can give back at another time, but also like let that flow
Yeah.
happen. It's so healing.
Mm, absolutely. Yeah. I remember when I was going through my divorce and I was in Colorado and a friend was like, I'm going to drive you into the mountains. We're going to sit on a boulder in the middle of a creek and you're going to let that boulder hold your pain. And it was just like I
Yes.
could release and cry, but I could literally feel like how the earth was not just like able to hold my pain, but actually it was an offering, like that there's something reciprocal in the allowing your tears. I mean, I always say like the earth needs our tears. We're in a drought.
Yep.
It was so powerful. And then it was like, as soon as my friend got a cancer diagnosis, I was like, I know the rock I'm taking you to.
Mm.
Such a special spot.
Oh, I love that. Yeah, a friend had said, so I live in Tampa and we've just had these crazy back-to-back hurricanes.
Right.
And my friend Michelle had said to me, like, oh my God, go hug a tree,
Mm,
like hug a tree right now. And there was something about like, oh my God, I need to just like go love the trees and the earth here for a while because they just went through a lot.
oh,
They just
Yes.
went through an intensity. And that sense of like, I was looking at all the debris on the ground, all the leaves and the tree branches and a lot of trees that were uprooted. I
mm,
mean, that was like
right.
it's crazy looking, like because the ground was so saturated.
Mm.
And then when the hurricane force winds came, there were trees that just literally uprooted. So you can see like on the side, you just see the roots, kind of dangling. And I mean, crazy, this uprooting. I'm like, wow, that is such a metaphor.
Mm-hmm.
It's like being in an earthquake in California, this like shaking, where you're like, okay, time to, readjust and reset. It has been a really intense time in that way.
Yeah.
Yeah. I actually want to make space for you to share a little bit about that because you're right there in the region.
Yeah.
And
Mm.
Even if you weren't directly impacted, everyone I know here has friends who, were either having to be out of their house because their house flooded. There were houses that burned down.
Mm.
I mean, it's just been, some of the stories are just so terrifying. So it's been a huge impact to the area. And, you also see that resilience piece, people coming together and working together. Everyone is lending hands and helping out and providing meals and helping clean up and stuff. And so that part was really heartening and heartwarming to see. But yeah, the natural disasters are it's been a lot.
Yeah.
Yeah. My husband is a native Floridian, and it's like, this is, kind of part of it. It's like you deal with potential evacuations but this, like no one that I know has ever seen anything like this, because they're saying, these back-to-back storms are like the first of its kind in, 1,000 years. So,
yeah.
Again, it's like, okay. We're okay now. And it was really terrifying. And that fear lives in your body. And, we need to let that have its say, a little bit and honor that, because it's a lot.
And it's like this idea of like, I'm okay now, we made it through it, but it's something that will happen again. You know what I mean? Like, it's almost like when you were talking about like as a teen, kind of waiting for the other shoe to drop.
Yes.
And so it's like you experience something really traumatic, and then it's not like you have a card and it's like, okay, check, you did the traumatic thing, you made it. Now we're moving on to the next life challenge.
I wish it worked that way.
Same. Because I feel like mine would be filled and I would be good for the rest of my life.
Mm-hmm.
But, I imagine it's like it lives in your body. You have this relief that you made it through, but always in the back of your mind, like, it will happen again.
Mm-hmm.
And that has to be that fine line that we dance in grief of, I was having a moment as I was adding another person to our ofrenda this year. And I thought, oh my God, like, I'm just going to do this every single year, or every other year, I'm going to add someone else that I love to this space. And the alternative, stop loving people, is like not going to happen. But it's like that. It's like, you make it through this and you're going to do it again. And there's just something really delicate about that, being able to live and be prepared, or being able to know it's coming for you again. And in a really tangible way with a storm.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's a lot.
It's a kind of a helpful way to look at it for me, as you're saying that, is that practice in impermanence, in the transient nature of all of our lives. And I've written about this a little bit too. It's like, don't take things for granted. I'm like, that's never been my problem. I sometimes have to go the opposite direction, because it's like, I look at the preciousness of everything, that fleeting nature. And it's like, oh my God, I'm in awe, I'm in awe of it. And it's, when I look at my loved ones, it's like, I am so terrified of losing the people I love. I've had to kind of make peace with that. And I think that that's something that I've learned. I used to be scared to even say that out loud. Like, I didn't even want to say that I'm terrified of losing the people I love. And now I'm like, okay, no, there's something helpful to say that out loud and to be okay with it. Like, yeah, that is scary.
Yeah.
And you keep on loving anyway.
And it's so
isn't that wild? It's like, sometimes I just walk around, I'm like, oh my God, I certainly felt this way with the storms and just life in general. Oh my God, I can't believe we're just like all walking around and going to the grocery store and picking out our apples and, and like, there's all of this going on. It's so intense. And how you hold all of those things at the same time,
Yeah.
Yeah. And as you're talking about all of that, like, I'm thinking about humor and your family. I knew I was drawn to you. Our souls were bound to meet. Like, this was important. and we lived like down the street from each other. That was what was so crazy.
Yeah.
But meeting your sister, your brother, your mother, and like things that I remember the most, I was just like, gosh, this family is like a comedic family. Like just like the
Uh-huh.
punchlines flying.
Uh-huh.
Like it was sweet because I think there's a part in me that, I mean, I'm like snarky and can be funny, but like I was holding back a lot. And there was something in our relationship where I was just like, oh no, be kooky, like go for it. Like we were dancing around your living room with kids' instruments, like the night
Yes.
Obama won the election, and like with me, you and Josh just like banging little drums and like being
Uh-huh.
absolutely
Yeah.
outrageously
Uh-huh.
silly. And so, you know, that kind of like the way in grief that can hold a certain space even. And I think it's like, I think it might have been on Shrinking. Like he talks about the first time he laughed, but like where you can kind of come back into relationship with,
Oh, yeah.
I still laugh like, and I can hold both, and there's tragedy and I laugh. Like the container of your family has that peace and humor. And so, yeah, if you want to talk a little bit about even how,
Oh,
because you're not afraid of your grief. It's
yeah.
not a bypass for you.
Yeah. Oh my God. Thank God for laughter. It's like if I was making a list of the things like that helped me with grief, nature and laughter would be up there too. And
Mm.
allowing yourself that, because I do think, I mean, there were times when right after my dad died, when we were laughing, and it's like, yeah, you're sort of like, oh, wait, I'm laughing right now. This is so weird. And you may even feel a little guilty about it, but it's like, oh God, no, yeah, this is so important. And I am so blessed that I grew up with parents who, like, my mom was really silly.
Mm-hmm.
That silliness, I'm like, oh my God, now I'm silly too. And I do it with my children and they're constantly rolling their eyes. But sometimes they laugh and I'm like, oh, this is not going anywhere. I will be silly until the day I die.
Yeah.
I hope, because it's just like, oh my God, life can be so serious and heavy. And I just need to
Mm-hmm.
laugh at it too, because it's really intense. Yeah, like I have some of these memories of when my mom was sick. So in the book, I talk about the difference between losing someone suddenly, and my mom died after being diagnosed with breast cancer. And so it was a longer illness, and there was, the anticipatory grief and a little more preparation, and how
Mhm.
different those experiences were in some ways and similar in others. But it's like never in my wildest imagination would I have thought that, my mom would be in a hospital bed in our house in New Jersey with her sweet face and a bald head. My family and I would be like dancing around her and putting on this ridiculous song called Enormous Penis. And watching my children crying, laughing so hard, and my mom being like, oh, this song is lovely. Wow, this is a lovely song, Lindsay, But it was like, oh, those moments of levity. And that happened all the way up until the end, even after she died. And my sister made a really weird joke when the nurse came to pronounce her death. It was like so in my sister's character. I mean, we're sitting in the room with my mom's body, and my sister said something, and it was the way she said it, but she was like, are you sure she's dead? And we all, like, he was like, what? And we all laughed because it was so like my sister. We're like, oh my God, you're making a joke right now, but also thank God you are.
Yeah.
Right.
There was another time where probably 2 days before she died, and at this point she was pretty much sleeping all of the time, and she was mumbling some things, and my siblings and I were all kind of standing around her talking, and she was concerned about someone. She didn't know if they were going to be okay, and are they okay? And I'm worried. I don't know if she's okay. And my brother just says, he's like, well, whoever it is, she'll be fine. I'm not worried about her. Whoever she is, she'll be fine. And the way he said it too, like, it sounded so sort of flippant. And like, here's my mom, like these last words that are coming out. And he's just sort of like, oh, she'll be fine. Don't worry about it. Taking these moments that are so intense and also being like, okay, there is such beauty in taking sort of the intensity, out of it and being like, yeah, we're just here trying to do the best we can.
Yeah.
And one of these gifts that we have are tears and our laughter. It's just such a relief to just enjoy those moments. So yeah, I think even when things are heavy, to laugh, like, I think we worry a little bit about like,
Mhm.
is that
Mhm.
okay? like, oh, it's not the right time. And it's like, oh my God, it's always the right time to cry and to laugh. Like, why do we
Yeah.
have to compartmentalize?
And it felt like a moment of normalcy, right? In
Yes.
this moment where
Yes.
everything feels like, I can't believe this is what's happening. I can't believe we're in this moment.
Yes.
And then your brother says this thing that's so in character for him. And you're
Yes.
like, oh, even though our world is upside down, we're still ourselves.
Yes. We'll still laugh.
Yeah, like we still laugh. We still have this like slightly inappropriate sense of humor
Yeah.
as a family.
Yes.
Like that's just who we are.
Yes.
And that makes it feel just a little bit familiar. I remember when my sister was the one to call me and tell me about my dad. And I just kept screaming at her on the phone, shut up, shut up, shut up, which is like not how I talk to my sister at all.
Right.
And she obviously immediately drove from Minnesota to Colorado. And I remember just rushing to hug her in the driveway. And we're hugging and crying. And she was like, and don't you ever tell me to shut up ever again. And then we're just like laughing, and it was just,
Yes. Yes. I so relate to that. When I told one of my best friends that my dad had died, and she started laughing, and it was like this weird, it was like she just couldn't. It was nerves. It was like didn't know. It was like kind of like what,
right?
But yeah, we laugh at that now because we're like, well, that was
yeah.
up,
Remember that time I told you like one of the biggest traumatic moments of my life, and you laughed in my face?
That was weird, but we're human beings. We're weird. We're quirky. I mean, yeah, you don't have to be different, or you don't have to be like, well, now I am very serious and everything is serious because I am going through this big thing. It's like, it's the wholeness,
Kind of going back, there was a moment where you were talking about like your dad would say like everything happens for a reason, and you're just like, I can't wrap my head around that. And it kind of reminded me, because I just rewatched the first season of Shrinking, but how his bestie Brian is like, everything goes my way.
Oh yeah.
And he's like, oh, I didn't say everything goes your way, but it's just like this toxic positivity that weaves its way through our culture. And then, when you have, it's like, oh, my dad was everything happens for a reason. And then it's like, and now I'm like left with trying to reconcile. This is senseless. There's no reason, and
yeah. I remember someone saying to me like shortly after his accident, like within that first like 12-hour period, there are no such things as accidents. And I was kind of like, what the heck? That is not helpful. And I mean, the platitudes, the things that people say, that is something that is kind of funny to me, because like so many of them are so terrible and ridiculous.
Yeah.
They're not helpful,
No.
but it's almost comical.
Yeah. He's in a better place. And I'm like, this was a pretty fucking good place.
Yeah. It doesn't feel that way to me.
I feel like he would choose to be here with me and his grandkids, but okay.
Yeah, I have this funny feeling.
As you're saying that, I was just thinking like that the implications in that are somehow I'm bad for not wanting him to be in a better place. Like how selfish of me to want him to be in the terrible place with me.
Right.
That's not what's happening.
Right, exactly. Yeah.
But that happened with my sister, like in her child loss. She, even in it was a group of mothers who had lost their children. She was like, several people in this group will say, I know God just wanted another angel. And she's like, cool. So now fuck God. And she's like, how is this comforting to them?
Yeah.
Like, I can't understand that. Yeah. It's just like a weird platitudes that are supposed to be comforting, but are actually kind of passive aggressive.
I was listening to this interview with Neil deGrasse Tyson, who I don't know if he identifies as an atheist or agnostic, but somebody was asking him about God, and he was like, the part I can't reconcile is that when people who believe in sort of like the big G person upstairs God, not like God is love, as you talk about it, Lindsay, which is, I believe in a universal connection that is love as well, but like a big G God. And he is both all powerful and all loving. And he's like, that's what I can't reconcile. Like, if you are all powerful and all loving, the tragedy that we witness every day in this world is like, I don't understand.
Yeah.
Then how is he all loving if he lets it happen, if he could stop it? It's just so interesting. And I get that people find their comfort in their own place. I think what becomes so offensive is like, you're trying to push your comfort on me as if your comfort that this all-powerful God means everything to happen feels good to you, that should automatically make me feel better.
Yeah, I felt that way after the storm here, and there was a lot of people saying, and I understand where they were coming from. It's just for some reason the way I was hearing it was like hitting me in the wrong way, and I'm like, maybe that I need to investigate that a little bit. But this sort of like, we're so blessed. We know other people weren't as fortunate. And so it kind of sounds like this little, fairy god is like,
Right.
you are blessed, you are not. You're going to go through shit. And I'm like, well, that doesn't feel good.
No.
That doesn't feel right to me. I know what they're getting at, but
it does feel like this tit for tat. I used to struggle with that even as a
Yeah.
kid. I was raised Catholic, and I was like, I would say my prayers. This will tell you so much about me as a human. I would say my prayers, and then they would keep me up all night because I was like, well, I can't just pray for my family because there's families out there who aren't being prayed for. So I would
Yes.
end up staying up so late because I was just like, well, if I don't pray for them, something like I'm hoping something bad doesn't happen to my family, but then that bad thing has
Right.
to happen to someone. Oh my goodness. It was very stressful.
Yes. I had a similar experience with prayer as a kid. Like it was more of like an OCD for me than it was like
Yeah.
prayer. Cause I was like, oh my God, wait, I didn't have to pray this way for that one. I don't want to, oh God, I forgot. Now something bad might happen to that one. And oh yeah, it was a lot.
Yeah. It's a lot. So,
Now I just send out love. I'm like, I just love.
Yeah.
yeah. So I do want to just include before, I feel like we're going to have to say goodbye at some point.
I understand. I know I could talk to you two forever.
Same.
So I'm thinking about, one of the moments that felt so important to me in your story. So here, all these years later, your mom is dying. It's a longer process. There's, the anticipatory grief, and there's your children, and they have this grandmother, right? What do we do with this? How do we bring them into the fold of like, this is what's happening? And so just telling us a little bit about what that was like for you.
Well, in the book, I speak about a conversation, Rebecca, that I had with you that was really pivotal and very helpful at the time. And you were relaying your story with losing your grandfather. We were out to eat, and because my kids at the time, my youngest was not quite 2, Will was 11, and Phoebe was 8. They were all young. And I just remember thinking like, there were some really upsetting things happening with seeing her in that way. I just was worried about them being in the room, especially as things got more advanced, and remembering her like that. And I didn't know what was best. And I remember, Rebecca, you saying to me like, yeah, how important it is to integrate them into this experience, that this is part of it. And it is hard, but when you're doing it together, and there was always so much love around us. I felt that way. And again, like all the attention to detail, that we had this incredible caregiver named Verna who was with my mom, and Verna just, the way she made everything look, when she was bringing her lunch, and it was just so loving. I think I was kind of caught up in some of the difficulties and some of the shock and sad things that they would see, but the opposite was also true. There was a lot of love to be a part of, and a lot of warmth and sweetness. And honestly, my kids in that, and I hope that this is helpful to anyone listening who's going through something similar, allowing them the opportunity to show their love and have that experience was really rich. I remember my daughter Phoebe, she wanted to give my mom a kiss. So I kind of picked her up and she kissed my mom on the cheek. And, one time my son wanted to stay with her when we were all going out to dinner. And so he stayed with her and Verna, and, just things like that, like allowing them that experience. And I think had I not, it really would have been my own fear that would have gotten in the way. And so I had to kind of look at that and be like, okay, well, what am I so afraid of? Them experiencing that death is a part of life, but it is loss and pain, discomfort. These things are so difficult for us as adults. And it's really hard to see your children experience those things, but but it is a part of
Mm.
it.
Mm-hmm.
I am so grateful for our conversation that day, Rebecca, because
Mm.
I brought my kids and they were there. And I mean, they were there a lot of different times, but even towards the end. And it was a
Mm-hmm.
really beautiful experience.
Mm.
Heartbreaking
Mm.
and beautiful.
Totally.
Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you for sharing it
Yeah.
because, yeah, I mean, I remember the conversation and I don't know, it felt like something overtook me. And it actually came up again last week. My stepdaughter, they were going to put her dog down, and it's a dog that they've had for a long time. And then it was at her mom's house. And my stepdaughter said, I want to be there. And they were like, no, you don't. And I got so emotional. And I was like, she's asking.
Yeah.
And this is part of life. And I know what you're trying to protect her from, but sadness and heartbreak are okay.
Yeah.
Hold her in it. Don't
Yes.
try to keep her from experiencing it because she's going to have bigger losses than this in her life. And like, if this is weird and we can't hold this and be with her dog and watch him transition gracefully or let
Yeah.
her have big tears and see he's alive and he's not alive and all of that, I'm like,
Yeah.
what's the message we're conveying? So I just got very emotional about it.
She needed to be there and like knew in her own autonomy how to get through that, how to move through that death and that grief. And so for her to ask, I'm so glad. I hope you fought for her. I hope she was able to be there because she knew that she needed to. And that's so tender. All of that. It's so tender.
So sweet. And Rebecca, you just said, like rather than keeping her from it.
Yeah.
Holding her in it. And that is like, oh my God, that is absolutely it.
The things that didn't get to happen, I think, in each of our stories, like growing up and kind of being like, sweep it under the rug, or like, you're like, that wasn't helpful.
It comes out from under the rug eventually, and it was really expensive.
Exactly. There's a lot of cleaning to do. So true. And, I had a similar experience after my mom died, and I was there when she died, not in the room with her, but in New Jersey. And Josh was with our kids in Florida and was on his way to New Jersey. And so they had gotten there after she died. My son was so upset. And, I remember saying to him, like, we're all coming together and we're going to be together in this. And talking about the cast of characters that was about to parade in, how wonderful it will be to see these people that we love, that loved her, and that somehow being together in it would make it so much better. And, I think he was 11, but I think that really, he was like, yeah, you're not alone. Again, it's that feeling of just like, coming together and being like, we're going to cry for Grandma Susie together. And then we're going to laugh when Uncle Richard says something ridiculous. And then we're going to cry again. And so that feeling of like, we're going to all hold each other in this experience. And my goodness, that is with life in general. I mean, again, I feel myself getting teary thinking about it, but it's like being here with you two today and just having this connection and this conversation that feels so deep and sacred and honest and real. And it's like, that's the beauty in our grief. It's so sacred, and it's such an opportunity for us to connect together in this thing that we all experience at some point in our lives, multiple over and over again.
Yeah. Beautiful. So how we wrap up is we check in with how we've been touching in with grief this week. And I'll start with Andrea. How have you been touching into your grief this week?
I set up our ofrenda, which is in Mexican and indigenous Central American culture, like an altar to your dead. And so you put up all these photos of your ancestors, and then you bring things that they will enjoy. They are going to come tonight and into tomorrow. Tonight is sort of like November 1st is like for lost children. So always thinking about Bryce, and I have a friend who he and his partner just suffered a miscarriage. And so we were just talking about when we suffered ours, a big one, and how we never really have talked about it since. I think I had this sense that Bryce just was like, that was really sad, and we're just going to keep trying. And I was like devastated. And so it was really beautiful. So we'll think about that baby tonight. And so it's very present for me right now. Yeah.
Thank you, Andrea.
Yeah.
How about you, Lindsay? Have you been touching into your grief this week?
So I had an experience. I am meeting with a genetic counselor right now to kind of assess my risk because my mom had breast cancer as well as colon cancer. And it was an interesting experience. I was talking to the doctor and she was so wonderful and asking a lot of questions. And part of it was just going over my family history. It was one of those experiences with grief where it just kind of catches you off guard. And I was talking very matter of factly about my mom's illnesses and the progression of her disease. And just saying it out loud, it just struck me how much she went through. I just felt sort of blown away in that moment, even though I've thought about this a lot. I felt it like, wow, my God, my poor mother went through a lot. So yeah, it was just a moment to allow my tears with this stranger. She handled it so beautifully. She really let me emote and she listened. And it was so sweet to have that experience with a physician. It was a really beautiful gift. Yeah, it took me by surprise, but it was powerful.
That's beautiful.
Yeah.
Thank you. Rebecca, how have you been touching into your grief this week?
Actually, just in this moment and in this interview, I was thinking about, so I saw this thing, my best friend sent me this woman who was talking about, she wrote a book or a movie or something, but it was basically about the relationship of a best friend. And she was saying, she's like, I've never had a friend that I've had since we were little or something. And she's like, and this relationship with a best friend it's like a soulmate relationship, this sense of kind of more important even than a spouse. And like the way that you're connected and you've gone through so much together and it's such a rare thing because she hadn't experienced forever. So it was like this really touching moment that, I was like, I love you too. I think about a lot how a particular lottery that I've won in life is like amazing friends. And I just feel that as I'm sitting here with the two of you. And I'm like, it's a beautiful grief, right? Because it's sort of like, in some ways, I know whatever hard experiences I go through, I have this incredible place to land. I have so many people I could call. I have, really cultivated these relationships in my life, sort of on a soul level, like not intentionally, but just sort of like, I just keep doing this. So something in me wanted this in this lifetime, but I feel it really deeply right now and in this conversation. So I'm just in that grief of the love that's so big that it just leaks out of your eyes. So I love you both. And,
I love you.
I love you.
Well, I guess we're going to say goodbye and everyone just take care of your tender hearts this week and in the holiday season that's just on us. I love you.
Love you.
Thank you for listening to this episode of All the Grief. You can find us on Instagram at allthegriefpod. And please take a moment to rate our podcast and share us with your friends. We'd love to keep expanding our reach to all the people who could benefit from conversations on grief. Take care.